screen now and see. Okay, I think you see it now.
Yes.
And I'm going to pass to the, okay. So here's my title. First of all, before I engage in this exercise, I want you to know that I cannot claim to be an expert on V.Y. Mudimbe. I'll put it like that because part of my presentation is on why V.Y. Mudimbe rather than anything else, the alternatives. And as I have discovered, it's really daunting to try to present Mudimbe in just a few minutes, 45 minutes, and then you realize that there are many things that you could have talked about that you cannot talk about because you don't have the time to do that, okay? Or because you don't quite understand what he was actually trying to do, because sometimes his writing becomes opaque, and you have to pause and think hard about what is intended there. And so, because people refer to Mudimbe, what you find on his publications is usually V.Y. Mudimbe. And V.Y. Mudimbe can actually be spelled out in two different ways. And so that gave me the idea of this title, Made the Real V.Y. Mudimbe Stand Up. And I think the way you would answer this question would be one of the ways. V.Y. Mudimbe is how I identify myself publicly, especially in my publications and in official functions. The fact that it can be spelled out differently since the Mobutu Cultural Revolution in the Republic, the then Republic of Zaire, gives me the flexibility of wearing the right garment for the right occasion without changing my identity. Changing my political identity from being Congolese to being a Zairois, that's inhabitant of Zaire, now DRC, and then later that of a Congolese American shouldn't change the essence of who I am. And that is really what it is. And Mudimbe has always been a kind of an enigmatic person for people that don't know him, and for people in lower status. It's also, for me, there was this aura of mystique around him, especially when I was a student at the National University of Zaire at Lubumbashi, and he was then starting his career too. There's the ambivalence between Valentin Yves Mudimbe and Vumbi Yoka Mudimbe. This was at a time when Mobutu started his Mouvement Populaire de la Révolution. Idiomatically, it should be People's Revolution Party. And it came along with his philosophy of authenticity. And the philosophy of authenticity meant we have to value what is indigenous to us. We have to celebrate our indigenous traditions. And that includes dressing in a way that is particularly Congolese. So the Congolese at one time were very highly associated with what is called abacos, a redesigned form of suit where you don't have to wear a tie, which in principle made a lot of sense because if you live between the tropics and it's hot most of the time, as an executive, it's a challenge to be wearing a tie and a suit, all the time. And so he designed that. People found it stylish, but people also found it as a form, especially when he put on his toque de leopard, special cap, uh, a way of wanting to impose one's own preferences to the whole population. And Mobutu was known as an autocrat, and he was abusing power. Now we speak of several executive orders in the United States. Mobutu had already started that in the Congo. Mobutu insisted that um, people change their names from Christian names to what we call non-authentic, so an indigenous name. On the surface, it sounds very good. But again, for many people, it was a kind of imposition. He didn't want to give people a choice. Imagine the whole country engaging in the process of changing their identifications, their IDs, in order to bear the authentic name. And a number of people, several people went after names of their ancestors and so forth, but that is not what Mudimbe did. Mudimbe didn't want to change his initials, and he kept the initial VY, and he changed it to Vumbi Yoka Mudimbe, and it's not clear whether the name is Luba, which is his ethnic group, or whether he just found the combination good enough and used it like that. After all, he was not going to spell it in public. He spelled it out in public, but in his official documents during Mobutu's regime, that's what people had to read. Abroad, he didn't care whether people said Valentin Eve or Vumbi Yoka, and so that's how it has gone. And that also reflects the attitude of the Congolese elite at that time, that Mobutu was actually promoting this philosophy, social philosophy of authenticity to take advantage of the people, so that they would become submissive, that you could say, you know, you go to the village, you have to respect the chief, and the chief stipulates what people had to do and so forth, so you shouldn't challenge me. And the intelligentsia in the Congo was very much opposed to that. A number of people went to jail when they protested. Mudimbe was very smart. He did it in this ambivalent way, so that they couldn't detect his resistance. I don't remember ever seeing Mudimbe wearing an abacus, but here are different pictures of Mudimbe. They are not from the time when he was in the Congo, but it is interesting because I think they illustrate the kind of enigmatic appearance, you know, very attentive. He was also a chain smoker at some point, but very people saw him in the picture where, you know, as in the picture where he's laughing or smiling, because he just looked so aloof, at least to us students that couldn't socialize with professors at that time in the Congo. Things were very much stratified in the academic population. The prestigious guys at the top, and then you have the average professors after them, and then the students had to live in their own world. They met the professors in the classroom, in the offices, if they had visits. We didn't have many of them, and that was the lifestyle of that time. He was the dean of the division of philosophy and letters, and he had specialized in the Romance languages, and I'm going to come back to that. I was in the Department of English Philology, and so there was no reason why I would interact with him. And the only time I did was when I graduated, and so he signed my diploma and so forth. And barely so when I worked as a TA at the university for 1 year before I came to the United States for my graduate studies. Okay. Um, and so I'll tell you why I also chose this picture where he's smiling, because it's relevant. He was very prolific. He started publishing as a novelist, and then little by little, he surrounded himself with young scholars, European scholars essentially, and this we will return to it later on, that were questioning the received doctrine about Africa, and they were all thinking very hard, but he didn't really pretend to be a philosopher when he was in the Congo. Okay, he was just a Romanist, a specialist of French, and spoke French with native competence, and really something unequal among his peers. He really stood shoulder high above his colleagues. Um, but these are the titles that caught my attention when I decided to discover Mudimbe as an intellectual. The invention of Africa, and then later on the idea of Africa, and then he co-edited the Encyclopedia of African Religions and Philosophy. And something that I really found very useful was the Mudimbe Reader, where I started familiarizing myself with his ideas. Otherwise, I knew him and anecdotally. Students talked about him. He had just returned from his training in Europe, and he became the deputy dean of the division of philosophy and letters. And aside from that, he was, we call it a savant, so erudite that you don't mess with, you keep him alone. Okay. Mudimbe straddled the colonial and the post-colonial periods in his education. Formal education at that time, during the colonial period and in the aftermath of independence, it was provided primarily by Catholic priests. And the best schools available were Catholic schools, private schools, although they were, subsidized by, funded by the government. And many of these schools were boarding schools. For college, you can tell. But for high school, there were very few high schools in the Congo when the Congo became independent. And the best ones were boarding schools where people were in dormitories and people had to speak French and so forth. And the schooling was in French. And there was a strong emphasis at that time on the humanities, especially what is known as belles lettres, literature. But everything written by European philosophies and European histories. Okay. Even at the time when I attended college, there were very few courses on African history. I'll come back to that. And Mudimbe was influenced by this kind of training. I think I made some comments at this forum a couple of weeks ago to help another speaker. So here you get a synopsis of Mudimbe's intellectual trajectory, both in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Belgium. Here said Democratic Republic of Congo. At that time, it should have been Belgian Congo. He attended Lovenium University in Kinshasa, which was an offshoot of the Belgian Catholic University of Leuven, or Louvain in French. And that is the kind of training that Mudimbe received, and there's more to it that we have to pay attention to. So here is what I found in the obituary published in the New York Times that I thought I would share with you. Valentin Yves Mudimbe was born on December 8, 1941 in Likasi. The town was then called Jadotville, in the Katanga province of what was the Belgian Congo, to Gustave Chilwila, that's his Luba name, who was a civil servant, and Victorine Galula, also Luba name. At a young age, he said in 1991 that he began living with Benedictine monks as a seminarist in Kakanda, in pre-independence Congo. He had no contact with the external world, even with my family, and indeed no vacations. And that's something that I experienced myself when I spent time in a junior seminary. I came home only for 2 or 3 weeks a year. Imagine as a teenager and you are away for most of the year. And so the way that they were preparing us to become the elite in the Congo, the intellectual elite in the Congo, by uprooting us from our indigenous background. When he was 17 or 18, he recalled he decided to become a monk, this time among the Benedictine White Fathers in Gihinda Mu. Here the name is written by something, Gihinda Muyaga in Rwanda. But in his early 20s, already completely francophonized, he abandoned the religious life and entered Lovenium University in Kinshasa. He graduating in 1966 with a degree in Romance philology. In 1970, he received a doctorate in philosophy and literature from the Catholic University of Louvain, that's at Leuven in Belgium, and he then returned to the Congo to teach. That happens the year when I took off from college, 1970, 1971, to go work for a year before resuming my training in October 1971. So my encounter with him was kind of delayed, although I worked when I did work that year, it was a preparatory school to college at the university, and his wife taught there. So I met his wife before I met him. Also, it was also the year of critical executive orders in the Congo that changed the education system. The university system was reorganized so that all the universities became campuses of the same university, the Université Nationale du Zaire, and there was a campus in Kinshasa, a campus in Kisangani, a campus in Lubumbashi, and each campus specialized in only some fields, not all the fields at the university, and they were meant to be complementary. It was Mobutu's strategy to diffuse things so in the best possible ways to avoid prevent students' uprisings against his regimes. Also, the New York Times obituary published this picture of the space where Mudimbe worked. It's interesting because you don't find many people working in this kind of space nowadays. And I think this space was in his home, not on campus. It reminds me of something because when I went to Duke University in 2006, and I'll come back to that again, he came to meet me and took me to his house just to show me where he lived and so forth, and then invited me out to dinner. And what I discovered was another interesting, well, several things. He showed me his living room, and the living room looked more or less like a garden. And I saw an aspect of Mudimbe that made him a kind of religious ecumenical. There was a statue of Buddha next to the statue of Virgin Mary and next to statues of some saints, and there were flowers all over. And I asked him if he attended to the garden himself. He said, no, I have a dedicated maid that attends to this as if it were her own property and so forth. And then he showed me the space of his house and his master bedroom that looked quite ordinary. But it didn't look like anybody slept there. And he said, this is for my guest. I'll show you where I sleep. A small bedroom with a twin bed, very monastic looking. And I think that reminded him of his experience in the seminary, where he was getting prepared to become a monk. And so I found it kind of strange that he chose to live quite modestly, whereas he had a big house, and he kept this nice bedroom for guests, and then the living room was transformed into a garden. But that tells us a lot about the kind of person that I'm going to discuss today. So I'll stop sharing my screen at this point, and I'll be checking my notes to continue my presentation. So Mudimbe, for me, was a polymorphous and a real intellectual, was polymorphous and a real intellectual humanist in the sense of multidisciplinary. That's, how earlier intellectuals up to the Middle Ages were trained. You had to know so many things. And you will remember if you read Greek philosophers in translation and so forth, these are the people that were foreigners of today's modern science. They didn't do philosophy the way that new modern philosophers do philosophy. You specialize in a certain domain, but you won't be dealing with biology or physics or whatever. But if you remember, those people speculated about the universe and were the forerunners of modern scientists. And that's the tradition that in which Mudimbe was trained. But he was also an enjoyable social being, friendly and altruist. Although now I have to repeat myself, earlier when I was a student, I thought he was so snobbish and aloof, and I just didn't understand him. Okay. So my opinion about Mudimbe actually changed after I invited him to speak at a conference at the University of Georgia, where I used to teach, both to the annual conference on African linguistics and two philosophers, separate sessions. So we got two of him for the price of one. Okay, that was in 1990. So imagine in the Congo, I didn't get to know him that way. Here, I was becoming close to him, not as a friend or whatever, but penetrate his private world, to private space in some ways, because he was a guest of ours at the University of Georgia, and I was hosting the conference on the annual conference on African linguistics at that time. So I also had the privilege of hosting him at my home one evening, and I said, okay, would you like to come and share a meal at home rather than in a restaurant, and meet some other Congolese that came here for the occasion? And he accepted the invitation. And at that time, he also used to drink a lot. Uh, I wouldn't pretend that he got high or whatever, but he was very comfortable with drinking. And at some point, he started telling us stories about his life, the time that he had spent at the monastery, telling us about odd things that he had observed in monasteries and so forth. And what I discovered, a witty man, a good storyteller, a jokester, and he made us laugh. And I describe him as a kind of, in the language of the Congolese, a animateur, a party animateur. So the one that holds the life of the party and so forth. We didn't have anything. We were all sitting, but even people that had known him more closely before we left the Congo, they also said, this is the first time we see him this way. What is your magic, Sally? I said, well, the magic was to bring us into an intimate space and be just among us Africans. And here we are remembering things about the Congo, and guess who's telling us all these funny stories? Not that eminent scientist that we were intimidated by in the Congo, but a very personable person. So years later, in 2006, when I visited Duke University for a job interview, he told me that an encounter with the police in Durham, North Carolina, in the late 1990s or early 2000, sorry, led him to stop drinking alcohol. I just noticed after when we went to the restaurant, he wouldn't drink. I don't remember whether he still smoked. But I said, why? I said, then he told me the story. There was a time when he had attended a party, and while driving back home, he was zigzagging, and the police followed him. And so he stopped. And when the police officer arrived, and he was playing Gregorian music in his car, and the police officer was surprised. A black man driving the car and playing Gregorian music. How often do you experience this? And the policeman became curious about his life, discovered that he was an eminent professor at Duke University. And the police officer just gave him a warning to be careful and so forth. And then started to ask him, where did you learn about Gregorian music? And he told him the story about his life. Now the story becomes more interesting. They arranged to meet on the weekend at his house. And the police officer brought with him some colleagues of his, and they spent time listening to Gregorian music. And then the police officers made arrangements that wound up with his being recognized as an honorary member of the police force in Durham. And so now he was under pressure to be an exemplary citizen a person were always been resistant to the rule and so forth. So that was a transformative experience for him. And I was so pleased that he shared this private story with me. But there was little time for me to discover why and how he had retooled himself and forged the complementary identities of philosopher, anthropologist, sociologist, and under the umbrella of Africanist. And the part that I could understand more easily is the wearing the hat of Africanist, because in his training, just like in mine, being an Africanist was the last thing on our minds when we were educated in the Congo. And as part of the elite, we had to imitate our European professors and emulate them rather than emulate heroes of Africa and so forth. And then I said, well, look, why are you shocked by this? Because you yourself, that is me, Sally, you did the same thing. You have become an Africanist. You have become a Creolist. These are things that you were not prepared to become when you were in the Congo. So this was a model of adaptation. He was ahead, 6 years older than me, but that meant a whole lot for us in the Congo, and that really impressed me. And if his experience was like mine, there were a lot of gaps about Africa that had to be filled in our knowledge, which means you retool yourself not just by pretending I'm African and therefore I know Africa. You realize at the same time how little you know about Africa. And you wonder where you are going to get the right information to really interpret Africa better. And that's also the kind of thing that comes with a lot of questions. Is the Africa described in this reference the Africa that I know? Or are there distortions that must be corrected? Because this is at variance with the Africa that I know and so forth. And this is actually what you find when you read Mudimbe, a lot of questions. Not necessarily adequate answers, but questioning what has been written by people that have become famous about your continent, and realizing that there were distortions of Africa, because the Africa that you read about is an invention of the writer. So that really struck me. Okay, so soon after he died, I thought it was time I stopped reading reading his work, especially the invention of Africa that everybody has been talking about, the idea of Africa that has received more attention and in which he clarifies a number of things. And then I was lucky enough because I thought I had bought these books already, but I didn't find them in my personal library. And one thing I found in my personal library was the Mudimbe Reader that was edited by Pierre-Philippe Fréture and Daniel Orels. So I discovered them that Mudimbe was a forerunner of what we call decoloniality now. So in his engagement with the Africa. In the chapter titled, When Was Africa Discovered, in the Mudimbe Reader, he reminds us that European so-called explorers were not the first to discover Africa. How often did we question this when we were being educated in Africa? that Europeans discovered Africa. Even people like me that had been trained also in high school, my specialization was in Latin and Greek, and there were mentions of Africa. But did I remember that the Greeks had dealt with Africa before the great explorations associated with Europeans since the 15th century? Okay, so the the difference is that the Europeans since the 15th century went farther south and around Africa to the east and reached points that the Greeks didn't reach and so forth. But a whole lot of what they did was also a way of checking the kinds of knowledge that they had preconceived of Africa thanks to their own culture that was largely shaped by Greek philosophy, um, um, the Roman Empire, the legacy of the Roman Empire. But overall, there was a kind of erasure of the knowledge that the Greeks had transmitted about Africa. And that knowledge sometimes clashed between uh, clash with what the explorers were recounting about Africa. What is interesting about these explorers is that when on those ships there was usually a botanist that would describe the kind of vegetation that was found in Africa, somebody that also described the kinds of fauna that was discovered in Africa and so forth. So you realize that by the time the Europeans decided to colonize Africa in the exploitation style, they had already learned quite a bit of knowledge and so forth. But throughout all this, what we also discover is that the Africa that the Europeans, Western Europeans would describe is not the Libya that the Greeks had described. The Greeks referred to Africa not with the name Africa, but with the name Libya. And Libya was used for the part of Mediterranean North Africa other than Egypt. They knew there was Egypt and that there was Libya, different from modern day Libya. Modern day Libya was named after I think the Italians tried to colonize Libya, but were not so successful. And the Greeks had known about Africa, not only Libya, Egypt, but also the parts of Africa south of Egypt. Okay. And later on in the idea of Africa, Mudimbe says, actually, when you think about it, the Greeks also went along the Suez Canal, not the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, sorry. There was no Suez Canal at the time. The Greeks went along the Red Sea and may have reached Somalia, which the Europeans didn't know, but the Greeks knew something about. But what we also find out is that when you now pay attention to what the Greeks thought about, a whole lot of it was also inventions. The Greek went to these places as merchants. They interacted with people on the coast. They didn't penetrate the interior of Africa. Okay. And in some places, they just didn't have any contact with the real people except for the people that they bought goods from and so forth. So there is room to also question even some of what the Greeks talk about in the narratives of Africa. Western European explorers and later colonizers racialized Black Africa in ways that serve the mission civilisatrice with little appreciation of African civilizations and cultural space practices. So one thing that I realize now is that the Europeans didn't want to acknowledge the fact that for about 7th century, the Arabs are the people that really control knowledge in the Middle Ages. It is through the Arabs that the Europeans would rediscover the intellectual legacy of ancient Greece and Rome. So Arabs were philosophers. They practiced the foundations of modern medicine. They introduced indoor plumbing. Practice the antecedents of modern financial system and so forth. Arabs contributed significantly to modernize Europe during the Middle Ages, but that is also erased from the writings of the Europeans explorers and so forth. It's like, terra incognita, the unknown world, and the Europeans were the people that were discovering it and claim authority on it and so forth. And there, Mudimbe it invites us to think again that the whole thing, there was a lot of falsehood in what we were reading. But the things become more complicated, he says, because a whole lot of what the Greeks did also was create myths about Africa to satisfy the imagination. That, for instance, when you read about Hercules meeting midget guys, ant size, that's the ants insect, ant size in Africa, and they bothered him and so forth. And what he did, he captured them and put them in a bag and carried them and so forth. And Mudimbe says, if there were such small people in Africa, that part of Africa must have disappeared because I don't see it. Nobody else talks about that kind of Africa. Okay, and he also talks about a story where these ant people would attack Europeans, but not really knowing what they could do aside from attacking them. So people of inferior minds, okay, not only very small, but of inferior minds, so population that didn't quite exist. And he said this is part of the mythology that the Greeks had created just to celebrate the outstanding position in Europe at the time. And the Europeans copied part of that. And what they did during the explorations was to find out if this reality still existed. Of course, they didn't find that reality, but the bit that persisted is that Africans, especially Black Africans, were anatomically and biologically inferior to Europeans. And so they created narratives that would help them justify the colonization of Africa. And they created an image of Africa that could serve the mission. So, but I also discovered more about Mudimbe's erudition, that he read Greek, classical Greek or ancient Greek fluently. He read Latin fluently. He could also write in Latin. And he read the originals of Herodotus and all these other big names in Greek or in Latin. And he even verified whether the modern translations were accurate and so forth. You know, how many of us do that kind of thing nowadays? Okay. And then he says, well, there's also a lot of myths. And indeed, there are a lot of myths in ancient Greek knowledge representation of the world. After all, didn't the Greeks invent their gods to their own image? They created the gods. They could erase some of the gods from the mythology and present new ones and so forth. And they tell you these anecdotes where gods actually trigger wars between the Greeks and other states. And much of it is based on women, where a woman had betrayed uh, uh, a god, and then to punish them, you know, they would go into war with the offender and those kinds of things. Who remembers that Icarus is the person that tried to fly with wings in wax, and then when they got too close to the sun, everything melted and they fell catastrophically, disastrously in the sea. And don't we remember the Trojan horse? Okay, how often have we stopped where the technology of the time enabled the people to build such a gigantic horse where soldiers would be hidden and then attack the people that pulled the horse into the city and kill them and so forth. So the thing here is that, yes, don't just be fooled. Don't be fooled by the beauty of the story, which is what we did as students in high school. But think about the factuality of the narrative, whether it makes sense and things of the sort. Okay. So in her review of Mudimbe's The Invention of Africa, titled An Afrocentric Critique of Mudimbe's book, Marlene M. Archie criticizes Mudimbe for not being African enough in the book because almost all the references are allegedly European. Indeed, when you read Mudimbe, you can see this reflection of the training that he had received. He had read the classics in European history, the classics in European philosophy, and these are his easy references. In the process, he gets to know African scholars, but not many of them, and then he cites them. But for Marlene Archie, this was not enough. Okay. To be sure, when Mudimbe attended school in DRC, just like myself, there were rarely courses taught on African history and philosophy. The closest thing that I, in the early 70s, got was a course on archaeology. And I didn't quite understand much, but there was nothing special about African social history or political history that I learned. These are the kinds of things that I learned on my own later on. And I think the experience was not so different from that of Mudimbe. We read about slave trade, but the slave trade that we learned about is that what was practiced by the Arab merchants in the eastern part of Africa. Later than the slave trade in which the Europeans were engaged, which was a gigantic enterprise and money-making enterprise, inhumane enterprise, that part, we were not taught about it. And for what I remember, European colonizers came to free us from the traffic, the human traffic practiced by the Arabs, and brought peace to the Congo. But they didn't tell us about how horrible the project, the colonial project itself was for Africans. So Mudimbe used his training in Europe to deconstruct what Europeans wrote about Africa and Africans. He certainly retooled himself in the United States, like I did, to develop more interest in Africa and to accumulate more knowledge about Africa, which enabled him to deconstruct the alleged universality of the European rationality, and he insists on it, that the European rationality, universal rationality, is a myth that we have to free ourselves from. His efforts may not have satisfied Afrocentrists, though one may also say Afrocentrists may have gone to the other extreme. Indeed, Mudimbe apparently criticized Afrocentrists for capitalizing too much on Egypt rather than on the rest of Black Africa. And it is debatable whether pharaonic Egypt was Black or Berber. And Mudimbe is critical of Cheikh Anta Diop for insisting that Egyptian civilization was Black, because that is not demonstrated yet. When you read the current state of the art about the migrations of human beings, so there was migrations out of Africa, but there was migrations back to Africa, and with the people that are classified as Afroasiatic are the people that returned to Africa about 3,000 years before Christ, and that is interesting. And from that perspective, if you push things further, the colonization of Africa is a set of migrations back to Africa as part of the human dispersal history around the world. Mudimbe did in fact connect with his contemporaries. There weren't many of them, not only Cheikh Anta Diop, but also the Beninois Paulin Jidenu Utonji, or the Cameroonian Achille Mbembe, or the Ghanaian Anthony Appiah. Yeah, he communicated with all these people. He didn't necessarily agree with them, but it's not religion, people comes with the different perspectives and so forth. And what he criticized about Cheikh Anta Diop's work is not his position that Egyptian civilization was not European. I think Cheikh Anta Diop did a great job of demonstrating that, and he drew evidence from the representations of the pharaohs on the walls, in the walls of the pyramids, and the representations of servants, and he could show, look at the images, they are not Indo-European, they don't represent Indo-Europeans. Whether or not people were Blacks is less relevant than the question that the basic arguments that Europeans had rewritten the history of Egypt in ways that suited their position that Black Africans were less evolved or too primitive to build monuments such as the pyramids. And this is at variance with what Herodotus, for instance, said about Africa. He credited Egypt with the originality of inventing trigonometry. And I don't know how many of you took trigonometry in high school. I did. I didn't understand much of it at that time, but I passed my exams. But the interesting thing is that nobody ever mentioned Egypt in relation to trigonometry. It's like everything else. Europeans were bringing these things to Africa and so forth. But when you read some of the more recent literature, Europeans were still in the darkness when what the Chinese empire emerged. Europeans were still in the darkness when people from the Arabs, having borrowed certain medical practices from India, brought these medical practices to Europe and modernized Europe when the Arabs, contributed to revolutionize the financial system in the world. But anyway, history is written by the victor, and this is what Mudimbe shows us in his work. Mudimbe did not question the undisputable contribution of Cheikh Anta Diop to analyzing, to understanding the pharaonic Egypt. This little bit I learned about Mudimbe over the last couple of months, and between my deadlines on my own research, and Mudimbe stood shoulder high above most of us. An excellent model of retooling and reshaping oneself intellectually, though he was not perfect, and nobody should be expected to be perfect. Everybody is contributing their share to reshaping knowledge in the decolonial endeavor. And his model interdisciplinary scholarship prompts us to invest our best to advance knowledge, which sometimes entails debunking myths and deconstructing the received doctrine. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, and was not just wanted, was capable of sharing with you today. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Salikoko. Now will be a conversation between you and Dr. Mufwene. Dr. Mufwene, the floor is yours.
Danny, thank you at two levels. First of all, I must say thank you for giving us names of people that we've actually followed up for this Mudimbe series. And then thank you for graciously agreeing to be part of the series as well. I want to get engaged in a conversation with you, but I want to find a way of getting into it. If you and Mudimbe, when you and Mudimbe were talking about linguistics or philosophy, what was his take on your work?
Well, in the encounters I had with him, we never discussed linguistics or philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but I think that if I had known what he's been doing, I think that my work would have been enhanced by his contributions, because I think we share the capacity of being subversive and asking questions that some people wouldn't dare ask. And so I think that I would have been a stronger subversive, encouraged by the kind of examples that I could find in him. But the challenging part, I wouldn't have had that. I won't have the time to develop the kind of breadth that he did. So, imagine anthropologists think he's a social anthropologist, sociologists think he's a sociologist, and philosophers think he's a philosopher. But in his training, the closest thing was to be a philosopher. But what kind of philosophy was it compared to modern practices of philosophy? And I think, and this is just a guess, that like myself or like you and other Africanist scholars, there's a lot of pressure under the circumstances to really figure out what is the best way to talk about Africa. What are the aspects of Africa that have not received enough attention that we have to bring to the attention of people, at least in terms of formulating questions or stimulating interest in those particular aspects of Africa. So, and I think that I've seen a contradiction. I mean, there are contradictions in all of us, but what has struck me is that Mudimbe, I don't know if I ever heard him speak Swahili or Lingala or Chiluba, his ethnic language. For Chiluba, when he went to school, I think people must have told him in school that Chiluba was a primitive language, so it didn't need any attention. And as a child, he was impressionable and didn't probably invest much in Chiluba. But who knows? Yeah, he's full of surprises. The people that write about him say he spoke so many different languages, but I have doubts about that because to become an elite in the Congo at that time meant to develop as much competence in French as you could. And if you were skilled enough in language learning, you wanted to sound like a Belgian or like a French person. So this is what it was like. And, we cannot blame him for not being able to speak these languages. And he certainly didn't try to write in African languages. And at that time, I guess the other thing is because the intelligentsia resisted Mobutu so much in many ways, not because the policy or the philosophy of authenticity was bad in essence, but because it was being used to serve the needs of the ruler and not to serve the needs of the population. It became a tool of subjugation. And so Mobutu spoke to the population in Lingala. But, I have not seen anything written by Mudimbe that is in an indigenous language. But then I don't know. He's so was so multifaceted, polymorphous, that I wouldn't be surprised if anything came from somewhere that was written by Mudimbe in any of these languages. Yeah.
And just two things, then we'll continue this conversation. I think you're right that the pressure we are faced with is what aspects or what type of African knowledge that we want to impart to our different students. My current experience, for example, is I have students, let's say, who are in architectural engineering and African studies, and others who are doing hospitality management and African studies, and others who are in art education and African studies. And then you have some who are in French and Francophone studies and African studies, applied linguistics and African studies. So as I sit back, I'm in about 13 different departments, all of them engaged in African studies. So the issue that then arises every time I'm preparing a course that I'll be teaching it for, is what do I teach this diverse group of students? They're all coming from completely different areas of understanding, from Mercy in architectural engineering, somebody in art education, somebody in applied linguistics, somebody in geography, somebody in hospitality management, somebody else in international relations. And the only thing that brings them together is some interest in Africa.
Yes.
The question that I want you to help me as a senior scholar is, what do I do with it, with that challenge? Right.
Yeah.
How do I use, let's say, no conversation about Mudimbe? Because it is important for them to also, let's say, understand Mudimbe. I'm faced with this group of students that is so diverse from so many different disciplines. The question is, how do I teach about Mudimbe to this broad group of students?
Well, the mistake would be to put them in a straitjacket and say,
Okay.
you
Okay.
belong here. And that's why I like characterizing him as a humanist, a little bit here, a
Okay.
little bit there, and so forth. But it's not really necessary to compartmentalize knowledge in the way
Yeah.
that we have
Okay.
been trained.
Okay.
He's bringing different facets of knowledge. He brought different facets of knowledge together to try to
Okay.
explain
Okay.
Africa.
Okay.
And for me, a whole lot of it comes in the form of questions rather
Yes.
than definitive answers. And
Yes.
it's a reminder that the education system in Africa should change.
Yes.
And that the people that are learning more about Africa now should make sure that that knowledge is conveyed in African schools to African students, so that when they come to face European culture as a foreign culture, then I think that encounter can enable them to put Africa in a different perspective and present it as
Yes.
from a native point of view rather than from an outsider's point of view.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks. Then let me ask the last question, because there are a lot of people who have more useful questions to ask. How was or is Mudimbe's work? How do people relate to Mudimbe's work from a French perspective? Right? How do French scholars engage with his work? Do you know?
My hunch is that maybe people should try what I did by accident, because I didn't find my copy of The Invention of Africa when I wanted to read it, and didn't find my copy of The Idea of Africa, so I had to order new copies. I mean, in my personal library, if the book is no longer in the section where I think it should be, then it becomes quite a challenge to find out one that with duplicates. But the accident really enabled me to read about the aspects of Mudimbe that experts on Mudimbe find to be essential. And actually, what I did, I skipped the first half of the book, of the Mudimbe readers, and went to the part where he talks about the representation of Africa and the like, and was amused by reading quotations in Latin or in Greek. But fortunately, they are also translated in English, so I can read the English translations. And so that's the start. And then after that, I said, well, let me see how Mudimbe really organized his discourse on the subject matter. And that's when you go to The Invention of Africa, you go to The Idea of Africa, and you have, as I realized, you have to be patient, because in the beginning there's a lot of philosophy and so forth, and then little by little you get to the meat of the discussion, how Africa is represented. How come, what a shame that you, as a person that was trained in Africa and should know about Africa, didn't know that there were such strange myths about Black people. If people my size are considered just midgets next to the side of Hercules. So either the Greeks were really giants and the Africans had the structure that they have today, or as Mudimbe says, if those Africans existed, we don't know where they have gone, because we don't see them. So that's it. And I guess in this kind of work, everybody has to find out what is the best way to explain Africa to Africans, and to tell them, listen, these narratives sound so good, it's entertaining, but that's the end of it. Don't get seduced by the entertainment, and try to see where reality as you perceive it lies. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Sally. Thanks. Let me give over to Laurencia, because she has a couple of questions and comments in the chat. Laurencia. Hi, Laurencia. You are muted.
Hi. Hello. Michael Scott also has a contribution to your presentation. He says, well, now he's clear that we are not discussing Mudimbe, but he's sure to have the conversation be made on Mudimbe. And Michael Scott also contributes says, on Belgian colonial Catholic seminary education, Andrew Bloom describes in the opening chapter of My Country, Africa, autobiography of the Black Passionara in revealing the really decolonial depth here, 14 years of education in the Brazzaville Convent Orphanage. The order of the St. Joseph of Cluny, it makes for compelling reading of a passionately told personal story that is replete with insight. Dr. Salikoko's account here of Mudimbe's own critique of colonial education is utterly consonant, albeit without the gendered perspective Gwen highlights. Thank you, Dr. Skull, for your contribution. Vanessa also has given the complex nature of understanding while questioning labels that are spoon-fed us. Can our creative reconstruction ever be as a group, or must it be individual? Mudimbe seemed alone in many ways to me. So what is your take on this, Dr. Salikoko?
Well, knowledge construction should be a collective endeavor, because reality is complex, and we don't perceive necessarily identical facets of that reality. And also our perceptions are biased, perception and interpretations are biased by our upbringing, intellectual trajectories. So I think it's necessary for us to confront each other, challenge each other. And that is how we are going to come the closest to creating an objective picture of Africa, but certainly not one that is meant to show that not the kind of image of Africa that serves the needs of outsiders. We need images of Africa that help us realize that we share humanity with different kinds of people, individuals and civilizations, and our civilizations deserve as much attention as deserve to be recognized in their own value, like other civilizations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cecil?
Yes, thank you, Sally, for sharing your knowledge on Mudimbe's personal life and as well his oeuvre. I was thinking, about something when you say that Mudimbe was a front runner of the decolonial the process of decolonizing knowledge. And I think, that's really a work that we should collectively do, in the sense that we think so much, and probably because in North America, and especially in North America, because in Europe it's less the case, but because the decolonial kind of school, and I say it like that, came to many North American scholars through Latin America. And so they think that the decolonial thinking is pretty late to the game. And by bringing back these people, and I'm talking about the French African philosopher who write in French, and you see that, these kind of discourses have been, going on since, at least from what I've seen, the late 1950s. And so we have to, people who are interested in Africa, we have to bring back, and I'm sure in other parts of Africa it's even earlier, but we have to, reclaim a timeline about this decolonial thinking by bringing back these works that are usually completely, undermined, not known by younger African scholars or by other scholars. And I think, it's super important that we collectively redesign, by unearthing or making these works available to the general public, reclaim another timeline of the decolonial thinking that has been, in a way, in academia, has been imposed on us, where, you mainly people who are not specifically interested in Africa just see the decolonial thinking through the, the scholarship produced in Latin America or by influential thinkers who live in North America, like, the usual suspects. So it's very important that we collectively do this we produce this decolonial library by, putting these people, Mudimbe, Utonji, and many others, bring back to our collective thinking about the decolonization of knowledge in Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, well, these are very important observations. Yeah, I don't know whether Mudimbe was in conversation with Walter Mignolo at Duke University, but that also brings up one of my own subversions, that the people that, in the Western Hemisphere that wrote about decolonizing knowledge, what is striking is that they don't recognize that the Americas are still colonies. There is no post-colonial United States, there is no post-colonial Brazil or whatever. All these places are still colonies in the sense that they have Europeanized, that the rulers are mostly or predominantly of European descent and so forth. And the indigenous populations have been kept on the margins of the modern societies. It's not like the experience of Africa, and there we have, we can speak of post-colonial period, but not necessarily of the colonial period. And these are different things that we have to bear their distinction in mind. And you are right. We can go farther back than Mudimbe. What Cheikh Anta Diop is almost a contemporary of Mudimbe, so it doesn't make much difference. But there is an anecdote circulating about Cheikh Anta Diop that the book that made him so famous was originally his dissertation. And when he defended his dissertation in France, it was rejected because no white person had ever come up with this idea that the Egyptian civilization may be non-black. I'm sorry, the Egyptian civilization may be black. Okay, it sounded absurd, but it's definitely, apparently, it's not Arabic either, because the Arabs migrated it to North Africa in the 7th century. Pharaonic Egypt dates from millennia before the Arabs got around there. So it's something different. And I told you about migrations back to Africa, the Afro-Asiatic populations. And the Afro-Asiatic populations, who were they or who are they? Okay. And in the region, you know, the people that have stuck there, the people that the Arabs came in contact with are Berbers. Okay. Were Africans in Egypt in some way, Black Africans in Egypt in some way in coexistence with the Berber, or what was going on. We have to learn more about that particular history, and that is part of doing decolonial science. So that needs a lot of attention. You are right. If we go back in time, there are people that were chastised for not thinking like their contemporaries, and those are the people that we should recognize too as paving the way for the decolonial discourse. It goes just far back in time. For any discipline, for any kind of paradigm that we embrace, it is interesting to retrace the history and see to what extent we may be repeating the same questions. And it's nice to know. Yeah.
Thank you. Oyironke.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm trying to get my view right. Multi-speak. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I like these sessions on Mudimbe, and I think this is the second presentation since Mudimbe's passing. At least this is the second one I'm catching. And I want to thank Salikoko very much for this presentation. It shed a lot of light. And I actually want to suggest that you publish something about some of those personal interactions you had with Mudimbe. It could fit very well in Africa as a country, even if it's a short 2 pages. So the reason I want to say something this afternoon is that in my book, The Invention of Women, which is almost 30 years old, I had a critique of Mudimbe. And now every time people talk about Mudimbe, I think of my critique. And I'm just trying to maybe out myself in terms of the critique, but to also say that at the time I wrote this critique, the invention of Africa was probably not 10 years old. I met Mudimbe a number of times. And I believe that Mudimbe was teaching at Stanford when I was at UC Berkeley. So in a certain sense, it was as if he was local. So I think that also influenced maybe my not worshiping him enough at that time. So I crave your indulgence if you allow me to read some of my critique at that time, because it tallies very much with some of what Salikoko just presented. So this is from my book, The Invention of Women, and I didn't take that title from The Invention of Africa, which is another story. So I started the critique through Anthony Appiah. Appiah had made some statements, and I said, Appiah fails to grasp that almost all institutionally privileged African scholars are being trained in the Western tradition. There is hardly any training at the academic level in African traditions and cultures. Because of this, It is rare, if not impossible, to find scholars who can discuss Ogun with the same sophistication and depth of knowledge with which they discuss Zeus. It is no wonder then that for many African intellectuals, Africa remains only an idea. Philosopher V.Y. Mudimbe's experience is telling enough. In his appraisal of anthropological texts on Luba peoples, Mudimbe poses the following question: whence comes my authority? End of quote. And this is the quote from Mudimbe now. It is true that I am not an anthropologist and do not claim to be one. I spent at least 10 years of my life studying ancient Greek and Latin for an average of 12 hours each week, with more than that amount of time devoted to French and European cultures before being eligible for a doctorate in philology, Greek, Latin, and French at Louvain University. I do not know many anthropologists who could publicly demonstrate a similar experience about their specialty in order to found their authority in African studies. End of quote. And this is my reaction. This was my reaction. Almost 30 years ago, I was a graduate student. I can see that tone, but I don't think my thinking has changed. I went on. I said, the more interesting question is this: what is Mudimbe's own claim to authority in African studies? He confesses that this authority rests on, and I quote, my Luba Lulua mother, my Songe father, the Swahili cultural context of my education in Katanga, the Sanga milieu of my secondary education. End of quote. And I go on. The contrast between his sources of knowledge about the West on the one hand and Africa on the other is striking. Knowledge about the West is cultivated over decades, but knowledge about Africa is supposed to be absorbed, so to speak, through the mother's breast milk. I have nothing against mothers. I am one myself. But while we as African scholars are busy developing the mother of all canons, who do we suppose will develop the knowledge base for transforming Africa? Of course, one cannot dismiss the knowledge of one's culture acquired during the crucial formative years. Neither can the possession of the mother tongue be overstated as a key to the understanding of a culture. Even so, many Western educated Africans do not stay long enough with their mothers to absorb the essentials of an African education. Like Mudimbe, many enter European-derived boarding schools or monasteries at an early age, embarking on a lifelong process of absorbing European cultures at the expense of their own. Like Apia, they may have been tucked away behind a hibiscus hedge. So I was reacting at that time, almost 30 years ago, to the idea that Mudimbe was an authority on Africa, and we should look to Mudimbe to learn about African culture. That was what I was reacting against. However, I did recognize that Mudimbe is an interpreter of European cultures. And that was so important, especially with his facility for languages. But I never understood why anybody thought that it was Mudimbe that was our expert on African cultures.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think you are correct in your assessment. Real experts don't claim themselves to be experts on the things that they do. People consider me an expert on this and that, but there are so many questions that you cannot answer that you become hesitant to identify yourself as an expert in on anything. But there's something else that has struck me, and you are there, you can correct me. Makoni is here, other people of African descent that are here. We absorb quite a bit of African culture by observing our parents do things, by observing our friends that were less fortunate doing things, and so forth. Even if I went back home only for 2 or 3 weeks when I was in the seminary, but there is a whole lot that I learned by way of contrast between what we did in the seminary and what people did in the village or in the hometown. And very often, retrospectively, I say, and Cecile has heard me tell her about this, now I can understand why my father behaved this way. Now I can understand why people did things this way, because at that time it was like a deviation of savagery from European culture. That was the civilization. So it's a whole life of reinventing myself as an African, or more specifically as a Muyansi, because I realized retrospectively all these things that I experienced or grew up in, or whatever, that shaped me as different from a Westerner. And then there is the challenge of confirming that my recollections are correct, and that's why you do field work of your own too. You can't presuppose that you know everything. And so this goes along with one of the questions that I received earlier. Should this endeavor be collective or singular? And it necessarily must be collective, because when I hear Makoni talk about his experience in school and where he went and got his degree and so forth, and we trade notes, then there are certain things that that take form, that we have to accept as a peculiarity of the time. So I don't know whether Mudimbe really claimed himself to be an expert on Africa or an authority on Africa, but he certainly did his homework in questioning the received doctrine. And that is a giant step, when you question the received doctrine and say, this doesn't make much sense about the Africa I grew up in. This doesn't make much sense if I see how my father did this and that, or how my mother did this and that, and so forth. And then, little by little, we reshape the knowledge that we should have about Africa. And that is really, for me, that is really what matters. It takes a lifetime to really come up with the most positive picture of Africa, or the most accurate picture of Africa, if it can be accurate at all. But we are also in a privileged position because of this experience, because we can question Westerners' accounts of their own practices. So why do you interpret it this way? How different is it from mine, and so forth? For instance, if you observe the working class in the United States, and you compare it with the working class in the Congo, what are the differences and what are the similarities? Say, for instance, in terms of exploitation by the employer. So we can reshape not only knowledge of Africa, but we also knowledge of the world, because we can ask questions differently and ask for answers that would appear to be more accurate. So in that kind of exercise, we really can contribute a lot to understanding humanity, what is universal about humanity and what is diverse about humanity that we also have to reckon with. I think that the previous literature, the state of the art, has overemphasized differences and not really paid much attention to the essentialist human factors or human facets of humanity that we all share in one way or another. So, yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, thank you. And on the question of questions, I think questions are very important. And when Makoni asked about how to teach Mudimbe, and you talked about he was always questioning, I remember something I heard from a colleague, and I always start my classes with my Africa classes, or even any class. I tell students, you must question the questions. That if you start questioning a question, you'll be surprised what thesis you could produce. I mean, why person asking this question and not that one? And so on and so forth. And then finally, one of the things that I see emerging here, especially from those of us of a certain age, I mean, Mudimbe was older than you, and you are older than me, and but when you talk about your experiences of going to university in Africa, my experience in Nigeria was slightly different in terms of being exposed to some Africa. Although I always complained that I didn't get enough of Africa, but now thinking about it, because I went to the University of Ibadan, and that was where the Ibadan School of History was. I learned about South African history, East African history, West Africa, North Africa, to the extent that when I went to Zimbabwe and I went to the hills of Matopos, and I was seeing some of the names like Nzilikazi, the names of the kings and all that, it was so familiar because I had taken an undergraduate course in South African history and did the same in Uganda. So I did get some of that, but of course there was a whole other lot of things that we didn't get. But now looking back at it, I did get some African history that continued to be useful. So indeed, maybe it's also in this forum that we should commission a book of some sort in which, people of a certain age write about their own early experiences. I think it would be very useful for students and so on.
I think that's something that has happened, especially to us Africans in the diaspora. Is a kind of artificial homogenization of Africa. And Cecile and I have discussed this, say, we are wrong in say in Africa, we don't do this. In Africa, this is the common practice and so forth. We overgeneralize from our personal experiences and superficial perceptions. I think that we have to evolve ways, part of decolonizing knowledge too, where we talk more about specific parts of Africa that we know, rather than talking about Africa in general terms. So, Europeans capitalize on the complexion of our skin and lump West Africans, Central Africans, and East Africans all in the same bag. Whereas in real experience, when you as an African travel in Africa, even 50 miles away, you already notice some cultural differences. And if you go thousands of miles away, the differences become even more obvious and so forth. But at the same time, it's striking that there is so much that we share, but we shouldn't forget that there are a lot of respects in which we are also different, even among Africans, and not necessarily along the lines of race, but just, in terms of culture, what particular culture people have generated where and so forth. We all eat fufu, all of us. That's another overgeneralization, but I can put it that way. But if you travel around, you'll see that fufu, as simple as it looks, is not cooked exactly the same way. Nor the material used, nor is the material used to make fufu exactly the same. Small details like that. Yeah. But thank you. That's very useful what you shared with us.
So I wanted to ask a question to Yeronke. Would you go as far as saying that Mudimbe became African in North America in a way?
I want to say not only Mudimbe, we all become what we teach, really. It's like saying that, I became a woman in the process of doing feminist discourses. It's like, okay, this is what a woman. No, but in a sense, yes. And for me too, I had never had any courses on Africa outside of the history. Because of course, the history discipline, the historians were at the forefront of the decolonization in the 50s. Ade Ajayi, the so-called father of African history, and I was privileged to go to that university. So I did some African history, but in terms of anything else, I always marveled at my American colleagues, both Black and white, that they had taken so many courses on Africa, on different aspects of it. So it was in the process of teaching Africa in North America that I learned so much about Africa myself. And in fact, one course in particular. So to that extent, maybe Mudimbe was not exceptional, maybe extreme. Extreme, but not exceptional in terms of the fact that he spent all those years in the monastery.
Yeah, well, spending the years in the monastery was really typical of the time. When you read the history of the Congo and the early politicians, I wouldn't exaggerate if I say 75% of them came from the monastery. I mean, they were being trained to become priests and then were either kicked out or decided to leave. I was kicked out for insubordination from the seminary. But so the priest knew that, I was asking too many questions that were embarrassing to them. But that is how people became part of the intelligentsia at the time. I'll tell you a private story. When I was in the 5th grade, I was in the playground playing with my friends, and my father came on his bicycle and he stopped. He said, "Son, I want to talk to you." I just talked to the parishioner, and they are creating this seminary in Kalonda. And so, seminaries are places where people receive a lot of good knowledge and so forth. So I made arrangements for you to be part of the funding student population. So in a few months, you will be leaving home and going to Kalonda. So I had no idea what went on in the seminary and so forth, but this is how I got the training. So that's not so exceptional, and it doesn't seem extreme to me. That's really the point I want to make, because we were among the fortunate people to have an opportunity to receive good education, only we didn't realize to what extent it was biased against ourselves. And we were trained in some ways to consider ourselves as inferior to white people and so forth, not only materially, which was very obvious, but then we had to believe that anatomically we were inferior, and mentally we were inferior, and we have to emulate Europeans. It's embarrassing that when it takes leaving one's country to realize, hey, I can perform even better than some of these Westerners. What's wrong with me? Why was I trained to think of myself as inferior? So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Desmond raised his hand.
Yes, Desmond, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Salikoko, for this session, and to everyone for the conversation so far. This has been quite enlightening in so many ways, and the conversation seems like there are various book projects in the making already. So thank you so much for this. I want to address my comments briefly to this conversation between Professor Oyerunke and you, Sally, because I found myself agreeing with both of you all through. And I'm led to begin to contemplate a bit of a synthesis. That is that maybe there are a lot of spaces for agreement in the point you're making. Perhaps you've already made that point, but sort of I'm voicing this to sort this out for myself too. So I do think, I agree with you, Sally, that there's so much we pick up by just being on the continent. As someone who was similarly following with the course of being in the seminary, if that is a course, in terms of sort of being led to think about yourself and where you come from differently. I value the perspectives I've been able to get, just being the times I've lived in the part of Africa that I call home, and the opportunities I get to visit frequently. I think I picked up a lot and have learned to listen in differently than I think might have been the case otherwise. Right? So I completely agree with you on that. I also agree with Professor Oyomi in the sense that those things I pick up, that I also think a lot of people who grow up on the continent pick up, may not be enough. And you recognize this when you encounter those who have devoted time to explore, to ask questions, to interrogate. And there are multiple layers of what I'm pointing to that come to mind. One is, most of the things I experience and I characterize as my understanding of Africa come from the time period I was born and the place I was born into. The most I have been able to get from previous generations have been stories from my father and my mother. And that goes only so far, right? So the opportunity for me to learn a lot about the longer arc of African history have actually been handed to me by conversations like this in supposedly intellectual fora. I don't think that I have spent enough time talking to people who are not in the academia on the African soil, trying to understand Africa from their perspective. So I think there might be something to that regard. And I don't even know that this need to be packaged only through courses in graduate school. I'm thinking more of What else are we missing about the transgenerational, history of Africa that are not registered on any university curriculum? How much time can I spend learning about those? So I think if we find ways to extend that mother's milk gnosis, that is the knowledge we are taking from our mother's milk, if there's a way to sort of stretch that out, maybe there is so much more to pick up if I spend not even 12 hours a week, maybe just 5 hours a week exploring this, not just reading books, but having conversations and, visiting people and so forth. Maybe there is much more there.
Yes.
The last note to ring here is, and this is part of why I think this is so important, Mudimbe and many like him are really excellent examples of people who, although they were led into exile, chose to come back home. They chose to ask questions. They chose to rethink what they were handed. There are so many other Africans who went through the seminary, many of them who became priests, who don't do what Mudimbe and Sali and Yerunke do. They don't question. They actually carry the agenda of white supremacy to its extreme. I have some of them as friends that are very difficult to have conversations with. Someone who is an erudite scholar, a philosopher, well established in European intellectual traditions, and also claims to be an expert on Africa, who will publicly make claims about Africa having invented nothing or having been worth nothing without Europe's intervention. This is someone who is in a position to know. I'm not talking about someone who has not studied. In one example, for instance, we're talking about someone who's held a prestigious seat in philosophical anthropology in Europe. Yet, the ways they understand Africa could be no further than what you would get from the, stereotypical dark continent narrative. So I think there is space for the kind of thing we are talking about here, both from the thing we pick up, just in our connection with Africa, how do we run with it, and the concerted study of that thing that will result in sort of a new awakening. And to round this off, and I'm coming back to what you said, Sally, that part of why this seems important to me is what it means to be African is so diverse, so complex, and so open-ended. I don't think you could ever define it. I don't think you could ever seal it in any definition. So when you raise that question of accuracy, my position, my thinking is, I don't think you could ever get anything African accurate. You can never get anything human accurate in the sense that you nail it down, you define it. You can get it down by exploring its various dimensions and chasing after the strands, but not to congeal it in some unified narrative, so to speak. So I will think of Mudimbe's journey as a human being as part of what it means to be African. I will think of our journeys as part of what it means to be African. If we follow, paleontology, for instance, follow what we know so far, the entire humanity is African. These are African journeys that have metamorphosed in various ways if we stretch our history much longer. So our ability to follow that story, to expand our understanding intentionally, I think could bear so much fruit. And, there are so many sessions like this, that in this forum, where I come off just feeling really like there's deep awakening and the desire to explore more, and this is one of them. And I truly thank you, Sally, for what you've done today, and for everyone again for contributing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your kind words, but I want to underscore the fact that you are so perceptive in making these comments. And one way of complementing that is that we have to realize that becoming or shaping oneself as a true scholar doesn't lie in just fitting in one paradigm And like in a religion, you just practice that paradigm. I mean, you have to be innovative in some ways. And we come up with these questions, and we have to be innovative in answering these questions or in articulating avenues that people have to follow or may want to follow in order to answer those questions. And I'll close this response with something I experienced here in Atlanta. I came to visit my daughter. And when I arrived, I saw a book on my bed. And I thought that she had left it there. It's a tiny book. She had left it there just by mistake. It was intended for herself. And she said, you have to look into it, open it. I opened it. It's a bunch of questions. And she said, you spend a lot of time doing your research, writing about Africa and the world and so forth. But there's a history of yourself that I haven't got. And do me a favor, answer those questions between everything else that you do. And then I get to know you too. And it's so personal. She's very inventive. And she said, and I thought, Cecilia, I said, well, this is one way in which I'm going to discover myself too. Not only for her, but even for myself. It makes a whole lot of sense. So, because you talk about that genealogical transmission of knowledge and so forth. And I don't know how she got the idea, but it's there. And I have a homework for myself and for her to do, and for us in the family with Cecile too, that people, we can discover things like this.
Well,
I think,
she's truly your daughter.
Yeah.
I said, she's truly your daughter. The fruit doesn't fall far from the tree.
Yeah.
Perhaps I should let everybody know I am back in Nigeria.
Yeah.
I'm back in Lagos after 41 years in the United States.
Yes.
And
You
my
mean
experience.
back or visiting?
No, back.
Yeah.
Yes. And so my eyes are open. I'm listening for things. But what is so clear to me in the perch I am in is that if I'm going to, anyway, I think part of what it says is that even if you're in a country or in a place, you have to move around.
Yeah.
You're located in certain spaces. There's a lot you are not seeing. There are all sorts of divisions, class divisions, ethnic divisions. Last night, I ordered Chinese food. It was good. And the young man who delivered it to my door, I've made it a point of duty to talk to people who come to deliver something. Because I'm learning, especially about young people's lives and what's going on in the country. And so when people give me their names, I am like Mobutu, authenticity. I want people to bear African names. That's my fault. So I'm always interrogating about names. When this young man came yesterday, and as he delivered and he wanted to go, he gave me his name. I could see he was from the north, so I knew I could speak some Hausa to him. And I said, where are you from? He said, Chibok. Did you all recognize that name? Chibok. Remember, Chibok girls were the ones that were abducted, hundreds. I said, oh my God, I'm seeing a Chibok boy. You know, I said, you're from Chibok. And we started to talk. And he said, you know, my sister was one of the abductees. I said, I'm so sorry. But she said, you know what? She was one of the ones who were subsequently rescued. And she's now in the university. I said, what about you? Did you go to university? He said, he went to the Polytechnic, but he can't get a job. I learn slowly but surely just from interacting with people. Otherwise, you are in your own corner. So I'm at that point where my eyes are open. I've been away, but I've never been away. I always spend 2 to 3 months in Nigeria every year anyway. But still, what it tells me is that we have to interact and move widely in order to gain wide knowledge, even of our dear Africa or wherever we call home. But I'm happy to be back.
Oh, this is wonderful. Let me just make some quick point quickly. I think something you're both adding to that conversation is that exploration is not just about putting in the time. It is about being honest, intellectually honest, being open-minded in exploring, not approaching the thing with your mind made up about what you want to find.
Right.
The reason this is important is some of the people I mentioned earlier who claim to be experts on African history, African tradition. And when you hear them talk about this, it's like, you people don't know anything. Come, let me teach you. This is African history, right? They do know enough to hang their predetermined positions. So when the mass, and they usually have the loudest microphone, so when people listen to them, you get this sense that this person knows what they're talking about, right? And they stretch that history far enough beyond what most people are familiar with. But my sense is that those explorations are not honest enough. When someone, and this is very well put, Oyerunke, earlier, when someone can spend hours dissecting, some ancient European intellectual artifact. Sometimes people spend hours on Plato, but you don't know much about something that is indigenous to your own ancestors. You haven't spent enough time asking those questions. Then my sense is that something is already lost in that process. You lose the ability to speak to it honestly enough. It's no longer a question of do you know. It's a question of how is your bias shaping the direction of the question you're asking, the conversation, and so forth. So I think that that open-mindedness is crucial. And Sally, I'm so glad your daughter did that to you. One of the things I've been doing with my father each time I'm in Nigeria is to have a video recorder on, and I just I poke and I listen and let him talk. And I think I'm beginning to learn finally. And much of the stories he's telling are stories he's told me as a child, but did not make so much sense until now that I have some bit of exposure to the rest of the world. And he's retelling stories. Things are sort of fitting in pretty well. So thank you again so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the contribution. And now we'll move on to the unrecorded and unmoderated session, the after party. You can feel free to ask any questions to the speaker.
So I thought we were already in the after party.
Right, I'll have to jump in here because this has been a fantastic presentation. You've excelled, Salikoko.